So normally on this channel, I just talk about Agave Utahensis, but today what we're going to be talking about is plants that grow alongside Agave Utahensis, Agave Utahensis companion plants. So normally on this channel, I just talk about Agave Utahensis because I'm a big Agave Utahensis nerd. I think it's the best agave, the coolest agave out there. And I just happen to live right in the middle of Agave Utahensis habitat. But today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different, and that's the companion plants, the plants that grow near Agave Utahensis that are not Agave Utahensis. And so before we start, I should probably caveat by saying this one thing. I'm an Agave Utahensis nerd, right? I spend most of my time looking at Agave Utahensis, taking pictures of Agave Utahensis, studying and reading about Agave Utahensis. And while I'm into and I like other plants and cactuses and things like that, particularly the ones that grow around the area that I live, I'm not a super crazy expert about them. So if I misspeak, and I'm sure that I may, or I'm sure that it's possible, or misidentify a plant here or there, please forgive me. Like I said, I'm an Agave Utahensis nerd, and I have actually been known to misidentify a cactus or two over on my Instagram. So I'm gonna try really hard not to do that today, but I just wanted to caveat with that. I'm a Utahensis nerd, not necessarily a cactus or these other plants nerd. So when we're talking about companion plants, the way that I'm gonna define companion plant here is basically a plant that lives, in many cases, near or around or in the same sort of area as Agave Utahensis. And there's a fancy word for that called sympatric, meaning that two plants share habitat, right? And so we're talking basically about sympatric plants, plants that are sympatric with Agave Utahensis. And a lot of that will boil down to a topic that we've talked about before on this channel in a few different videos, but something called life zones. Basically, in the mountains here in Nevada, at the base of the mountains, like the valley floor here in Las Vegas is about 2,000 feet above sea level. And it's really, really hot and dry, and it's been that way for tens of thousands of years. But there are mountains here that go up to and above 8,000 feet of elevation. And so as you go up these mountains from 2,000 to 8,000 feet or so, every 1,000 feet or so of elevation represents a very different climate, right? The higher up a mountain you go, generally the lower average temperatures are, and the more precipitation you see. And what that means is that there's different plant and animal species that live at each of these levels of elevation. And this concept is called life zones, right? And basically, going up 1,000 feet is like going, I think it's north like 100 miles or something like that is the equivalent. And so when we talk about Agave Utahensis and the plants that are sympatric with it, there are a lot of plants that grow here in the Mojave, but primarily grow at low elevations. They grow on the desert floor at 2,000 feet or just above it at 3,000 or 4,000 feet, but there are not a lot of Agave Utahensis that grow down at those elevations. Generally speaking, and there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, Agave Utahensis really only grows above 4,000 feet, and it really starts growing in a lot of cases and a lot of elevation above 5,000 feet and up into 5,000, 6,000, 6,500, maybe even touching 7,000 feet in a lot of cases. And so when we look at the plants that are companion plants that are sympatric with Agave Utahensis, we're generally talking about those Mojave Desert plants that grow up in those elevated life zones, right? And of course, I've talked about this, like last week we went out to Agave Utahensis nevadensis habitat, which is way up above 6,000 feet of elevation. And I've previously taken you all out on the channel to Agave Utahensis eborispina habitat, which typically tends to be a little bit lower, 4,000, 4,500, 5,000 feet of elevation. So there are some pretty big differences in the plant species that are co-occurring companion plants to Agave Utahensis eborispina versus Agave Utahensis nevadensis. And then there are, of course, different just areas, as we've talked about, because of those life zones, right? Agave Utahensis can't grow on the desert floor, it can only grow in really specific bands of elevation. Basically, it's growing in what are considered what are called sky islands, right? A sky island is a imagine that the desert floor, which the Agave Utahensis can't grow on because it's too hot and dry, is like an ocean, and those little bands of elevation where it can grow, those life zones where it can grow in the elevated areas in the mountains, are like islands, right? And so a lot of Agave Utahensis populations are isolated to themselves, right? There'll be a few miles of population, and that's the little island that population of Agave Utahensis lives in. And then, several miles over, across the desert floor where it's too hot and dry for Agave Utahensis, there'll be another ridge line or mountain peak or whatever, which will form another sky island where Agave Utahensis can live in. And so in these sky islands, there is also, again, a difference a lot of times in companion plants. And then another concept that comes up a lot when we're talking about companion plants, particularly when we're talking about desert plants and cactuses, are nurse plants. And the idea with a nurse plant is that, desert conditions are xeric, and they're dry, and they're very, very hot, right? If you've ever grown a cactus from seed, you'll be familiar with this, is that cactus seedlings are actually pretty fragile. They need quite a bit of moisture and some pretty well-controlled temperatures. And so, out in the wild, out in the desert, in a harsh desert environment, seedlings of, Agave Utahensis or of a cactus need sometimes to be protected from the harsh sun rays, or at least 12 hours, 16 hours. They can't take that many hours of harsh sunlight, and then they need a companion plant that will also help collect some moisture for them. With Agave Utahensis, there are some companion plants, and we'll talk about them in a bit. There's generally not the case that there are a ton of companion plants with Agave Utahensis. And I think one of the main reasons is that, well, there's several reasons. One is that a lot of the places that it grows, there just aren't that many other very tall plants. There are a couple like banana yucca and some of the tree species, junipers and things like that. But most of the other things that grow out there with Agave Utahensis aren't a whole lot taller than it is. And so there isn't a whole lot for it to grow under exactly, right? And another reason why I think nurse plants aren't such a huge deal when it comes to Agave Utahensis companion plants is that I think the majority of new plants that are growing of Agave Utahensis out in habitat are actually not necessarily from seed, they're from offset. And big giant clumps of Agave Utahensis kind of form their own nurse plants, right? As a ring of Agave Utahensis expands and new offsets grow from the rhizomes, from the roots at the bottom and the outside of those rings, they're kind of growing underneath, a larger, already more mature Agave Utahensis plant. So in a lot of cases, Agave Utahensis is its own companion plant. In some cases, there's actually even nurse rocks, right, where Agave Utahensis seedling will start to sprout underneath a small rock or medium-sized rock, and then eventually it'll outgrow that, but for a while it's really small, it'll be protected by rock. And those are always super adorable, so I take pictures and videos of those when I can. But let's get into the companion plants, the plants that I see oftentimes growing alongside Agave Utahensis out in habitat. One of the most popular, and I know it's the most popular ones because every time I post it on my Instagram, it gets a whole bunch of engagement and likes and comments and all that kind of stuff, is the cotton top cactus, Echinocactus polycephalus. And I know there's been some name changes and some taxonomy changes about this plant before, but this plant is super cool looking. Again, I'm an Agave Utahensis nerd, not a cactus nerd, so sometimes for me it can be a little bit difficult to distinguish it from another cactus that we're going to talk about in a second, barrel cactus or pharaoh cactus. But the Echinocactus polycephalus grows these really, really cool red spines. It grows in clumps in a way that pharaoh cactus generally doesn't. And it's called cotton top because, at the top of the plant, there's a lot of these fibers that will often grow on a mature Echinocactus polycephalus that give it the name cotton top. Another set of plants that grow companion, that grow very commonly with Agave Utahensis, are the hedgehog family of plants. And I'm going to be starting with the common names for a lot of these plants because that's how I was introduced to them, and only since I've become a bit of a plant nerd have I started learning the scientific names. But there's the hedgehog family of plants, of cactuses, which are Echinocereus. Primarily the ones that grow near Agave Utahensis are Echinocereus engelmanii or engelmanii, and Echinocereus mohaviensis. And there's another name for that, Triglo I don't know, Triglo something, but I've been told that it's still cool to call it mohaviensis, and that's easier to pronounce, so I'm going to go with that one. But we'll start with engelmanii hedgehog. So Echinocereus engelmanii, obviously that's named after George Engelmann, a renowned botanist who named a ton of plants out here in the desert Southwest, including this Echinocactus or excuse me, this Echinocereus, which is the hedgehog. And the reason they're called hedgehog plants is they're kind of short, and they're columnar cactus. They grow in a little column, but it's not like a pharaoh cactus where it's a giant column. It's pretty small columns, and they generally grow in sort of clumps. So if you see a young one and in the distance and you only kind of see the silhouette, it's pretty low and it's just sort of popping its head up. And so I guess it can kind of look like a hedgehog. And I think Echinocereus anglomanii and some of its varieties can grow really, really crazy spines, which are super cool looking. And then their flowers are just absolutely gorgeous in the springtime when they do bloom. And then the other one, the Mojave kingcup hedgehog cactus, or Echinocereus triglo, whatever, or Echinocereus mojaviensis, is really similar. The individual little hedgehogs, the individual little columns tend to be a little bit smaller on that one, but again, it is also gorgeous when it flowers in the springtime. And a lot of times you'll actually see both of these hedgehogs growing like literally right next to Agave Utahensis. Sometimes they'll be sprouting from the inside of an Agave Utahensis clump, which is always really fascinating to see, because then you start wondering about, well, if this hedgehog is a slow growing cactus and it's inside a ring of Agave Utahensis where an Agave Utahensis plant used to be, but then, you know, it flowered and died and dried up and now there's just dirt where there was an agave. How old is this whole clump? And that's a whole fascinating other rabbit hole that we're going to go down in future videos when I talk more about Agave Utahensis rings and clumps. And so, as I said, a lot of times, you know, because again, I'm an Agave Utahensis nerd, not a cactus nerd, I have a hard time sometimes telling Echinocactus polycephalus, cotton top cactus, apart from pharaoh cactus. But generally speaking, when you're looking at a mature pharaoh cactus, it's pretty easy to distinguish that from a mature echinocactus, because the variety that grows here and sometimes alongside Agave Utahensis is California barrel cactus, or Barrel cactus cylindraceus, and that can grow really, really tall. It generally doesn't clump as prolifically as Echinocactus polycephalus does, and so generally it's a much more singular cactus. It's, you know, it's a barrel cactus. Everybody kind of knows what a big barrel columnar cactus looks like. And in fact, in one area, not in an area where Agave Utahensis grows, but in a different area that's actually on lava rock as opposed to the limestone that Utahensis prefers, I've actually seen, I just kind of came across a really cool crested pharaoh cactus where it looks like if there was maybe some insect damage or something, you know, in the apical meristem and the sort of the growing point at the tip of the cactus that was damaged, and so it grew into this really cool sort of bifurcated shape that I think is super fascinating. But again, pharaoh cactus and Echinocactus polycephalus generally grow more commonly alongside Agave Utahensis eborospina, primarily because both of those grow in lower elevations than, say, Agave Utahensis nevadensis, right? So with nevadensis, it's much more common to see it alongside those hedgehog cactuses. You can go way up into the mountains, 6,000, 7,000 feet, and still find a Echinocereus cactus, hedgehog cactus, up there alongside Agave Utahensis nevadensis, but up there you generally don't see Echinocactus polycephalus or Pharaoh cactus cylindraceus. It's generally down in the lower areas, 4,000, 4,500, 5,000 feet, where eborospina is growing, that you see those two growing alongside of it. Now, before I even became an Agave Utahensis nerd, before I really became a plant nerd as an adult, I've mentioned once before on this channel that when I was a little kid, the first thing I wanted, like, you know, you ask little kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? The first thing I had, my first answer to that question was a plant breeder. And so I guess I've always kind of been a plant nerd, but when I started paying attention to the plants out here in the desert, I had actually been desert trail running and rock climbing and hiking and off-road driving and all that kind of stuff for years in this same habitat before I ever really started paying attention in any serious way to the plants that were growing in the areas that I was recreating, that I was running or something. And one of the first types of cactus that I actually noticed when I was trail running is the Cholla, is Cylindra puntia. And if you've spent any time running in the desert, particularly running anywhere around here or running anywhere around Cholla plants, you'll know exactly why that was the first cactus that I noticed, is because I had a lot of run-ins with it. You know, Cholla is often called jumping cactus because basically, you know, it's super sharp spines, and then those sharp spines stick into your skin, and they don't let go, and then they break off that, you know, stem will break off the plant and travel with you. So, and when I was first getting into trail running, I fell a lot. I haven't fallen a whole lot recently. I guess maybe I'm getting better at it or just slower or paying attention more. But I used to fall constantly. And many of those falls, I became very, very acquainted with Cholla. And if you've had any experience with Cholla, or again, the next species of plant we're going to talk about, you know what a pain spines can be. Now, Cholla is super common around Las Vegas. It does grow down, really low in elevation. The species that grow lower in elevation that are really, really common around here are things like buckhorn Cholla or Cylindropuntia acanthocarpa, right? Those are pretty big Cholla plants. They're pretty big, thick stemmed, really robust plants. Those are like one of the last one you want to encounter. We don't really have teddy bear Cholla in this area. Teddy bear Cholla, and when I say this area, I'm pointing to the west of the valley. Teddy bear Cholla tends to be a bit more over to the east side, sort of where Lake Mead is, versus the mountains, the Spring Mountains on the west side of the city where Agave Utahensis lives. But we also have Cylindropuntia echinocarpa, which is silver and golden. That is another very, very common type of Cholla. Neither one of those, there are not a lot of areas where Agave Utahensis and those two kinds of Cylindropuntia occur sympatrically, just because of the elevation differences. There are a very few areas sort of on the escarpment leading into the Spring Mountains. If you've ever visited Vegas or gone to Red Rock Canyon, like that recreation area, there are some areas in there where there are a couple of Agave Utahensis, not huge populations or anything, low down at least. And then there will also be some Cylindropuntia, some Cholla plants, but it's so common here that it's definitely a companion plant to Agave Utahensis. And again, because of how memorable Cholla is, it needed a mention. Now, there are two really interesting kinds of Cholla that do, one occurs sometimes or a bit more frequently than the other two alongside Agave Utahensis eborispina, and that's pencil Cholla, or diamond Cylindropuntia, which is a much smaller kind of Cholla than the normal, the acanthocarpa, the buckhorn, or the echinocarpa, the silver and golden Chollas. It's much smaller, much less spines. It's got spines, but it's not the kind of, angry silver Cholla spines that, you're used to, you think of when you think of a Cholla plant. And then there is probably the rarest form of Cylindropuntia, which is Cylindropuntia multigeniculata, I hope I'm pronouncing that scientific name correctly, or blue diamond Cholla. It's named blue diamond Cholla because it basically only grows, well, it was first described in an area called Blue Diamond Hill, just outside of Red Rock Canyon here in Las Vegas. And then it also grows in a couple other areas. I have yet to visit an area where it co-occurs with Agave Utahensis, but I know for a fact that it does grow in an area where it should occur sympatrically with Agave Utahensis. I just haven't had the opportunity to visit that area yet. But it's a really, kind of looks like teddy bear Cholla in that it's got so many spines, it almost kind of looks fluffy. Spoiler alert, it's not, none of these Chollas are fluffy, no matter how they might look it, so please don't mess with them. But it's super low growing. It branches really frequently, right? So you don't see these big, long, it's not like a tree looking type of Cholla like a acanthocarp, like buckhorn can often look. And so that's the Cylindropuntia family. And then related to Cylindropuntia, of course, is the Opuntia family, or the prickly pear family, which when it comes to, cactuses you don't want to run into out here in the Mojave Desert, I personally would list Cholla as a first and Cylindropuntia as a second. A lot of folks might actually list Opuntia as the number 1 cactus you don't want to run into, primarily because, not just because of its big spines, but because of its tiny little glochid spines, Glochid. They are tiny little, almost invisible spines. It's basically like fiberglass. If you've ever handled one, you can have a ton in your hand and your finger and your arm, and they're almost impossible to even see to get out, but they hurt. And so they do occur sympatrically. They do share habitat with Agave Utahensis. And again, when I was running, I also became very unfortunately and sadly and tragically became very fortunate with this kind of, or very familiar with this kind of cactus also. So the ones that occur Out here there's a few that occur, but primarily there's Opuntia basilaris, Opuntia beaver tail prickly pear. That's a very common one, particularly in like landscaping. There's Opuntia polycantha, which is like grizzly bear. That one tends to grow up a bit higher up, so you'll see that one more commonly with Agave Utahensis and nevadensis. Grizzly bear prickly pear has almost sort of fuzzier, furrier, hairier looking spines, for lack of a better word. They're not, again, don't be fooled. It may be friend shaped, but I promise it's not a friend. Don't hug these things. And so that does grow alongside Agave Utahensis in some areas. And then there's also Opuntia chlorotica or pancake Opuntia. There's Opuntia ficantha or tulip prickly pear. And then Opuntia diplorcina, which is western prickly pear. One thing that's interesting about a lot of those plants is that they were used pretty heavily by indigenous folks that lived in the area hundreds and thousands of years ago. If you can manage to get all the spines off of a prickly pear, you can eat them. They actually taste pretty good. I think in Mexican cuisine they're called nopales. I have them with my carnitas, and they are delicious. And then you can also eat the fruits of the prickly pear too. I think there are some other of these plants that I'm mentioning, like hedgehogs and echinocactus, where the fruits are also edible. But I do know that there has been remnants of Opuntia prickly pear that have been found in roasting pits, in agave roasting pits. So it does seem like there was some pretty prolific use of them, eating of them, roasting and eating of them by indigenous folks that lived in the area. And then there is another plant that grows next to Agave Utahensis, and this one grows very commonly next to both Agave Utahensis nevadensis and Iborospina, and that's the pincushion family of cactus. Now this one is one of the ones that I have trouble distinguishing from each other, like the individual species sometimes. The primary one, the one that I guess you see the most, is Escobaria vivipara. And what's cool about these is these are tiny, they're called pincushion cactus because they look like tiny little pin cushions. They're about the size of, if you've ever seen one of those like pin cushions shaped like a tomato, those little stuffed tomato things. They're about that size, and then they're covered in spines. They're really small though, so they're not as, the spines aren't quite as angry and as dangerous as Cholla or prickly pear. But what's really cool is in a lot of areas, particularly like Agave Utahensis nevadensis territory, habitat, there's a lot of limestone gravel. And so these guys, these pincushion cactus, Escobaria, will sometimes be really hard to see. They're almost sort of hidden, retracted into the gravel. And so you'll be walking along, you won't see any of them, and then maybe say you see a cool Agave Utahensis plant, you stop, you kneel down and take a picture of it, and then you start looking because you're closer to the ground, you say, oh my goodness, there's a whole bunch of Escobaria or the other forms of this pincushion cactus that are around. And again, these are also really, really pretty when they flower. They can have multiple flowers going off from a single little globular, I guess they're globular cactuses, all at once, and they're super pretty looking. And then, related to that, I guess it's not technically a pincushion cactus. To me, they look very, very similar. I guess its common name is actually, it's considered a fishhook cactus, is Mammillaria tetranicita, but it's a mammillaria, so there are some differences about, where on the plant the flowers bloom from, and then that there are fishhook shaped spines. But again, I'm a Utahensis nerd. I'm not great at identifying these cactuses, so this is one of the ones that I posted on my Instagram where I've been like, oh, look at this cool Escobaria vivipara, and everybody's like, nah, that's a mammillaria, and they tell me all these ways to remember it, and I'm terrible at that one. But they are super pretty looking. They're super duper cool looking. I love those ones. Again, particularly in the springtime when they flower, the flowers are just really, really cool looking. And because they're so small and the flowers are so vibrant, when they're grown amongst gravel or big giant rocks, they look like the comparison, the contrast, the juxtaposition between the jagged hard rocks and then this tiny little pin. It's a very aesthetic looking cactus. And then I guess related to that, because it's also a fishhook cactus, is Echinomastus johnsoni, which I have yet to see it actually growing in a place where Agave Utahensis also grows. I've only seen it grown in other areas. But I feel like it deserves an honorable mention because it's such an amazing looking cactus. And so Echinomastus johnsoni, while it has cool purple flowers, the thing that makes me say it looks so awesome are its purple spines, right? I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, I saw it kind of from a distance. I was at the end of a long and pretty arduous hike, and I was like just ready to get back to the truck and get some cold beverage, and then get home and take a shower and lay down. But I went off trail, like a quarter mile off trail, because I had seen this small, it's not very tall, it is columnar, but you know, it's you know, about yay big. And I remember being just like, what is that thing? With super purple spines and flowers, but it looks super cool. And so that's why, again, I haven't seen it personally yet in an area growing, you know, right next to Agave Utahensis or in an area where Agave Utahensis grows. But it looks so cool that I felt it deserved a mention on this list. And so those are the primary cactus companion plants that you find in the area or near the areas where Agave Utahensis grows. But there are a couple other plants that are not necessarily in the cactus family that I think are interesting to talk about. The first one, or the first family, is the Yucca family of plants. Primarily, probably the most famous Yucca is Yucca breviifolia, or Joshua tree, essentially. There are, I guess, two different subspecies, varieties, whatever, of Joshua tree. There's Western Joshua tree and Eastern Joshua tree. The one that grows here is primarily Eastern Joshua tree, but in either case, one of my favorite sort of stories about them is the reason that they were called Joshua trees is that the early Mormon explorers to the region noticed that because, you know, we're in the northern hemisphere here and Joshua tree is growing towards the sun, generally when you see it out in habitat, it's almost always pointing south. So if you find yourself lost in the Mojave Desert and you're like, which direction is which? If you look at a couple of Joshua trees, you'll notice that they're pointing south, and that can be a really easy way to find your way, to sort of geolocate out in the desert. There are a bunch of yuccas that grow around here, Yucca mojaviensis, and a few of them. Another one that I think is really interesting to mention in association with Agave Utahensis, because Joshua tree does grow. There are areas, particularly Agave Utahensis eborispina, lower elevation Agave Utahensis, that grow next to Joshua tree. But even the Agave Utahensis nevadensis that grows way up, you know, again, 6,000, 7,000 feet of elevation, there's a type of yucca, Yucca baccata, or banana yucca, that grows right next to it in a lot of cases. And in fact, what's weird is that when banana yucca is really young, it can kind of look like a regular Utahensis, Agave Utahensis, you know, sort of spineless, enormous Agave Utahensis subspecies Utahensis, a regular Utahensis. And in many cases, it almost looks, and I know this is probably not true, but it almost looks like, because they occur right next to each other, banana yucca, Yucca baccata, is not monocarpic, so it's very often flowering. You can very often see its flowers and fruiting bodies in the spring, summer, and fall. But sometimes you see Agave Utahensis plants that kind of look like they've hybridized with banana yucca, Yucca baccata. Again, I know it's probably not the case, but they look like they have. And what I mean by that is that they look very plain, right? Because banana yucca doesn't have, you know, lateral spines or terminal spines in the same way that Agave Utahensis does, but it has sort of generally the same rosette type shape, again, particularly when it's young. It is sharp. I think there's other name for it is Spanish bayonet, because if you run into it, I think it's also one of the more dangerous plants out in the Mojave, somewhat surprisingly, because if you run into one of these things, or if a dog, for instance, runs into one of these things, it can be pretty dangerous. They are pretty sharp and pretty hard, and they're much bigger than, say, a spine on a cholla, which is just sort of painful and annoying, but probably isn't going to do any serious injury or damage. But yeah, so banana yucca, really interesting, grows sympatrically, grows alongside Agave Utahensis in a lot of cases, even nevadensis, way up in the mountains, up at elevation. And then there's a couple of trees, right? You know, we talked about life zones at the beginning of this video where, you know, as you go up in elevation, the climate changes, the temperature goes down, precipitation goes up, and thus you have different species of plants and animals that live at each one of these elevation zones. And one of the elevation zones, one of the life zones that Agave Utahensis nevadensis grows in primarily is called the pinyon juniper woodlands. Basically, it's demarked or denoted by the fact that a lot of pinyon pine plants and juniper trees grow alongside Agave Utahensis. And these two trees are actually two of the only nurse plants that you'll see, or two of the only plants that you see commonly be nurse plants for Agave Utahensis. And what you'll commonly see is either pinyon pine or juniper tree. And way up in the mountains, they don't grow super duper tall. They have these sort of kind of gnarled trunks, and so they're sort of lowish to the ground. And so they provide obviously a lot of shade cover for any plants that are growing directly under them. And in some cases, you will in fact find Agave Utahensis plants growing directly under a juniper or a pinyon pine. And those plants have a pretty different morphology. They sort of look different than plants, Agave Utahensis plants, that are growing out in full sun exposure and full UV exposure. And those differences primarily come down to, they generally tend to be a lot bigger, right? Because there's less UV stress on them. They tend to be a bit greener than the, glaucous blue covering that you'll see on plants exposed to a lot of UV stress. And then also they tend to develop much larger clumps as opposed to hollow rings, right? And again, we'll talk about this more when I do the videos on Agave Utahensis clumps and rings, but I think that's basically because the lowered sun stress and the lower sun exposure that the plants that are growing underneath these trees get allows them to grow much larger and bigger before they flower, and probably grow much older than the plants that are getting full sun. And so generally you see these much more vertical, larger clumps of Agave Utahensis that are growing under these trees in shade than you would, just out in a field where there's no cover. You see much lower clumps, much smaller clumps, and then the clumps tend to be hollow rings, right? Because the oldest plants that were in the center have long since flowered, died, and dried up and just sort of become dirt again. And then the last companion plant to Agave Utahensis we're going to talk about, and there are, I should also say this, there are a ton of other forbs and perennials and grasses and all this kind of stuff that grow next to Agave Utahensis. I'm an Agave Utahensis nerd, so these are just the ones that I've noticed and I think they're the coolest, mostly cactuses, obviously. But another plant that I think deserves an honorable mention because it grows alongside Agave Utahensis, nevadensis, Antiboraspina quite a bit is something called the Phedra viridis, or viridis, which is colloquially known as, its common name is Mormon tea. And the reason that it's considered Mormon tea is because, again, the early Mormon settlers, who were some of the first European folks to explore this area, would make a tea out of it, would steep a tea out of it. And if you heard me say the name of it, a Phedra viridis, you probably have a hint as to the chemicals that they were ephedra, which is the chemical, it's a very, very potent stimulant that they were actually brewing out of the teas. And so I think, the Mormon Society of the Mormon Religion has some restrictions on intake of caffeine, but apparently not a whole lot of intake on this much more powerful stimulant of ephedra that comes from this natural source, this Mormon tea. And so the whole plant is actually named after that use, Mormon tea, Phedra viridis. And this also, there are some areas where it grows a bit bigger, than Agave Utahensis. And so you will sometimes see it as a nurse plant providing some shade to Agave Utahensis, but none in quite the way that the juniper and the pinyon pine plants do. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. What are your favorite companion plants to Agave Utahensis? Have you been out in Agave Utahensis territory, maybe out in California in areas that I haven't been yet, and seen another kind of cactus or tree or plant that deserves a mention on the list of the coolest Agave Utahensis companion plants? And thanks for watching.